It began on a frozen mountain trail where a Navy SEAL spotted an overturned wheelchair half buried in the storm. Beside it, an elderly man with no legs fought to stay alive, his loyal German shepherd refusing to abandon him. The SEAL lifted them both from the snow, unaware that this moment was no accident, but a turning point written long before any of them arrived on that mountain. Through the blizzard, through fear, through memories that still haunted him, he carried the old man toward dawn, and what the elder revealed later would change the SEAL's heart in a way no battlefield ever could. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, drop your city in the comments, and if you believe God sends the right animals at the right moment, hit subscribe, because this story might restore your faith in purpose and in miracles. Snow hammered the Windscar Ridge Valley, driven by a sharp winter wind that carved restless white spirals through the endless Wyoming pines. The storm blurred the world into shifting shades of gray and silence as evening crept closer. Evan Brooks gripped the steering wheel of his old F-150, its engine humming steadily as it crawled along the narrow mountain road layered in fresh snow. He was 34, tall and broad-shouldered, built like a man who had spent half his life carrying heavy gear through hostile terrain. His face bore the traces of sun and war: angular jaw, straight nose, a faint scar running from his cheekbone to the corner of his lip, and it made him look older than he truly was. His dark hair, kept short out of habit, contrasted with his pale winter skin, and his eyes, steel blue, always watchful, showed the lingering tension of someone who had not quite learned how to live outside the battlefield. Since leaving the Navy SEALs 3 months earlier, Evan had wandered across small towns and quiet roads, telling others he was simply taking time off, though he knew the truth was messier. He was searching for something he could not yet name, and the silence of places like Windscar Ridge was the only thing that didn't overwhelm him. Tonight, though, the silence felt wrong. The storm was too fierce, the forest too still, and the narrow road showed something out of place. Faint tire tracks weaving toward the outer edge, where the mountains sloped sharply downward. Snow was already beginning to fill them in. Evan slowed the truck and leaned forward, relying on instinct sharpened by years of reconnaissance. Something had happened here. He could feel it. A few yards later he spotted it. A wheelchair lying on its side, half buried in snow, one wheel still spinning weakly in the wind. His pulse tightened instantly. Wheelchairs didn't just end up like that. Someone had fallen, someone vulnerable. He braked hard, stepped out into the slicing cold, and the wind immediately clawed at his jacket. Snow gathered across his shoulders as he trudged toward the overturned chair. And then he saw the man. Walter Granger looked like the storm had sculpted him from frost itself. He was around 60, with a beard the color of winter ash, tangled and frozen at the ends. His face, though deeply lined with age, carried a gentleness that had endured despite hardship. Both pant legs of his thick wool trousers were neatly folded and pinned, revealing why he was dragging himself through the snow. He had no legs. Walter's breath came in sharp, ragged bursts as he pushed himself forward with trembling arms, fingers reddened and stiff. His gloves were missing, his sleeves were soaked. He wore a heavy flannel jacket, buttoned wrong in his haste, and his round spectacles were frosted over so thickly he could barely see. Yet even in that state there was a strange, stubborn resolve in his posture, the kind possessed by those who had long ago made peace with suffering. "Sir," Evan shouted above the wind, "stay still, I'm coming to you." Walter froze, not from fear, but exhaustion. His arms collapsed beneath him, and he sagged sideways into the snow. A weak bark split the storm. From the shadows of a snow-laden pine, a German shepherd emerged, limping but alert. The dog, about 5 years old, had a rich black and tan coat now clumped with ice, and deep amber eyes filled with desperation. His name tag glinted faintly. Ranger. The shepherd wedged himself between Walter and the wind, growling softly when Evan approached. Protective, loyal, terrified. "Easy, buddy," Evan murmured, lowering himself into the snow so he wouldn't seem threatening. Ranger's ears twitched, his breath fogging in frantic bursts, but he didn't lunge. Something in Evan's calmness, or perhaps something in the dog's instinct, told Ranger this stranger meant no harm. Finally, the shepherd stepped aside, though his gaze never left Evan's hands. Evan shrugged off his heavy parka and wrapped it around Walter's shaking form. "Sir, can you hear me?" At first there was no response. Then Walter blinked slowly behind his frosted glasses. "I tried to get back up the road," he rasped, his voice thin. "Chair slipped. Ranger tried to pull me. Storm came too fast." His words dissolved into a cough. Evan glanced at the overturned wheelchair and then at the steep bank beside the road. If Walter had rolled any farther, he might have vanished down the slope entirely. The thought made Evan's stomach twist. "You're safe now," he said firmly. "I've got you." But as he lifted Walter into his arms, Evan felt the old familiar tension rise in his chest. An echo of missions gone wrong, of teammates he'd once carried through chaos. The weight of the old man was different, though. This wasn't combat. This was someone fragile, someone the world would never expect to survive a night like this. And yet he had tried. That resilience stirred something in Evan's memory he wasn't ready to face. Snow stung his eyes as he carried Walter toward the truck. Ranger followed closely beside them, occasionally nudging Evan's leg as though reminding him not to falter. "You did good, Ranger," Evan said, glancing down. "You kept him alive." When he reached the truck, Evan set Walter gently onto the passenger seat. The old man's glasses had slipped, revealing soft gray eyes muddied with pain, yet gleaming faintly with gratitude. "Thank you," Walter whispered. "Didn't think anyone else would be on this road." "Wasn't supposed to be," Evan admitted. "Guess the storm had other plans." Ranger jumped into the back seat, curling around Walter's discarded blanket. Evan retrieved the wheelchair, shaking off the snow, folding it into the truck bed. His fingers numbed quickly, but he barely felt it. Something else occupied his mind, an unsettling sense of recognition. Walter Granger might be a stranger, but his desperation, his stubborn fight to stay alive, it mirrored something inside Evan, something he had avoided acknowledging since leaving the SEALs. By the time Evan climbed into the driver's seat, Walter was shivering uncontrollably. Evan started the heater and spoke gently. "We need to get you out of this cold. Can you tell me if you live nearby?" Walter hesitated, as though ashamed of the answer. "Not exactly nearby," he murmured. "My cabin's 3 miles up the old Ranger Trail." Evan frowned. "In this storm, that's impossible to reach." Walter closed his eyes. "I know." Silence filled the truck as wind roared around them, but inside, a fragile warmth began to gather, born not from the heater, but from the realization that fate, or something like it, had crossed their paths tonight. Evan tightened his grip on the wheel. He didn't know what awaited them on the mountain, but one thing was certain: neither Walter nor Ranger would be left in the snow again. The storm thickened as Evan Brooks steered the truck deeper into the mountain corridor, snow swirling like torn white fabric in the headlights. The world outside looked as if it were collapsing under its own cold weight. Inside the cabin, breath fogged the glass in slow, uneven pulses. Walter's breaths weak and trembling, Ranger's panting sharp with worry, and Evan's steady and controlled, though beneath the surface a familiar unease coiled tight in his chest. Walter Granger leaned back against the passenger seat, Evan's heavy parka wrapped around his frail upper body. His long gray beard, still clinging to ice, rested against the jacket collar. Without his glasses, carefully wiped and set onto his nose by Evan, Walter's pale gray eyes would have been blinded completely by frost. His cheeks sagged slightly with age, his skin thin and lightly freckled beneath the cold burn. Yet even in his exhaustion there was something resilient about the man, as if hardship had shaped him into something unbreakable despite his missing legs. Ranger lay curled behind them, his thick black and tan coat rising and falling with each pant. His amber eyes never left Walter, following every shiver, every wince. The dog's right hind leg bore a slight limp, and dried ice clung near the joint, a sign he'd been struggling to support his master long before Evan arrived. As Evan drove, he scanned the road ahead. The path leading down toward the nearest town, Windscar Crossing, was blocked by a drift of snow nearly as tall as a pickup. Branches jutted from it like skeletal fingers. There was no plowing crew in sight, and in a storm like this there wouldn't be until morning. "We're not making it to town tonight," Evan muttered, checking the rearview mirror out of habit, though he knew no one was following them. Walter stirred. His voice, thin and raspy from cold, filled the cabin. "I figured as much. The ridge closes up fast in storms like this. That's why I tried leaving early." He let out a trembling breath. "Should have known better at my age." Evan shook his head, jaw tightening at the thought of Walter struggling alone on the road. "A storm like this would have put anyone in danger, and you weren't wrong to try to help Ranger." Ranger let out a soft whine, pressing his muzzle against the space between the seats. Walter lifted a weak hand, brushing the dog's ear. "Fellows like him, they depend on us. You do what you can." Evan swallowed hard. Those words hit deeper than Walter likely intended. The SEALs had depended on him too. Some days he still saw faces he hadn't managed to save. The truck jolted over a buried stump, snapping him from the memory. "We're heading to an old ranger station," Evan said. "Used to use it as a temporary shelter during high country operations. It's abandoned now, but it'll get us through the night." Walter nodded, exhaustion weighing heavily on his features. "If it's warm and dry, it'll do. And thank you, son, for stopping. Many wouldn't have." Evan didn't reply immediately. Praise always went awkwardly on him. "Anyone would have stopped," he finally said, though even he knew not everyone would. The trail narrowed as he turned off the main road. The truck's tires crunched over untouched snow, the path steepening slightly. The wipers struggled to keep the windshield clear as a crosswind slammed into them. Walter watched Evan silently for a long moment, studying the younger man's sharp profile, the cut of his jaw, the disciplined set of his mouth, the deeply rooted vigilance etched into his eyes. "You've carried people before," Walter said softly. "I could feel it when you picked me up. Not just strength, something heavier." Evan's fingers tightened around the wheel. "Used to carry teammates. Sometimes out, sometimes not all the way." His throat tightened slightly. "That weight doesn't leave." Walter nodded gently, his own voice carrying the tone of a man who knew grief intimately. "Loss changes how a man breathes, but it doesn't mean he stops breathing." Evan didn't answer, but his jaw loosened just a fraction. A sudden gust rocked the truck. Ranger barked once, alert. Ahead, the trail dipped, then climbed sharply toward a cluster of dark shapes barely visible beneath the blanket of snow-covered pines. The ranger station. It sat elevated on weathered stilts, its wooden siding faded from years of sun and storms. The small porch sagged slightly, and the windows, though cracked, remained intact. A metal chimney rose from the roof like a crooked finger pointing into the storm. The path leading to the station was buried, but Evan recognized the silhouette instantly. "Hang in there," he said quietly to Walter and Ranger. "We're close." He parked the truck as near as possible, but even so, the steps leading to the cabin were partially blocked by a drift of snow nearly 3 feet high. Evan turned to Walter. "I'll carry you up. Ranger will follow." Walter gave a faint smile, weary but trusting. "I suppose I should stop pretending I can walk there myself." "Walking's overrated," Evan replied gently, trying to lighten the moment. Ranger let out a soft, playful huff, as if agreeing. Evan exited the truck into the storm. Snow slapped against his face immediately, cold and sharp as needles. He hurried to the passenger side, opened the door, and lifted Walter into his arms with practiced steadiness. Walter weighed surprisingly little, a fact that only deepened Evan's concern for how long he'd been out there. Ranger jumped from the truck, landing in the snow with a soft grunt before circling protectively around them. Step by step, Evan pushed through the drift. The old man held close. Walter's head rested against Evan's shoulder, his breath warm but faint. Once on the porch, Evan shifted Walter slightly to free one hand and pushed open the cabin door. The hinges screamed from years of disuse. Inside, the air was bitterly cold, but still sheltered from the wind. Dust coated everything in a thin, gray-blue film. A stone fireplace sat at the far wall, its iron grate rusted but intact. A small wooden table leaned crookedly near the window. Cobwebs stretched like fragile bridges between the rafters. Evan gently set Walter into a wooden chair near the fireplace. Ranger shook off snow and positioned himself beside Walter, tail low, ears still alert. "We'll get the fire going," Evan said. "You'll warm up soon." He scavenged for anything usable. Old logs stacked against the wall, brittle but dry enough. Scraps of paper left behind by rangers years ago. Even a broken chair rung he snapped off for kindling. He crouched and began building a fire, his movements precise, methodical. It grounded him, like assembling gear before a mission, like restoring order in chaos. Walter watched him quietly. "You're calm in storms, not just the weather kind." "Storms don't bother me," Evan said, striking the first spark. "It's the quiet after them that I'm still learning." The spark caught. Flames slowly grew, casting warm orange light across the room. The shadows along the walls softened. Walter extended his hands toward the rising heat. Color began returning to his fingers. "This cabin reminds me of where I used to take my wife," he murmured. "Long time ago, before I lost my legs, before she passed." His eyes glistened faintly behind his glasses. Evan stopped feeding the fire for a moment. "I'm sorry." Walter nodded. "Life has its storms. You weather them or you don't. Tonight, I almost didn't." Ranger pressed closer against Walter's side, as if sensing the shift in mood. Evan sat back on his heels, the fire warming his face. "You said you were taking Ranger to the vet. Is he hurt?" Walter brushed a hand through the dog's thick fur. "Just a strain in his leg. Slipped 2 days ago. He hid the pain like dogs do. I promised him I'd get him checked before it got worse." He swallowed, shame creeping into his tone. Didn't expect the trail to ice over so quickly. I misjudged the storm. You survived because you kept moving, Evan replied. That counts for something. Walter chuckled softly. Barely moving, but I suppose it does. The fire grew stronger. Warmth filled the small cabin, thawing both skin and silence. Snow continued hammering the roof, but inside, the three of them were no longer at its mercy. For the first time in months, Evan felt a sense of purpose settle into him, not from a mission briefing or an order, but from the simple, grounding truth that he had saved someone real, someone who still had a life worth protecting. And this time, he had not been too late. As the storm raged on, Evan fed the fire again, his eyes reflecting the glow. Outside, the world was buried under cold and darkness, but inside the abandoned ranger station, something fragile yet unmistakably alive began to take shape. A connection forged not by choice, but by necessity, and strengthened by shared survival. Before dawn would come, the three of them would face new threats the storm had concealed. But for now, in the flickering warmth of the fire, they breathed the same steadying truth. They were no longer alone. The fire crackled softly inside the small ranger station, its warm glow struggling against the cold shadows clinging to the corners of the abandoned cabin. Snow struck the windows in steady bursts, like 1,000 tiny fists demanding entry. Yet within those wooden walls, sheltered from the punishing storm, a fragile sense of calm began to grow. Evan Brooks sat near the hearth, the orange light shifting across his angular features. His short, dark hair was still damp from melting snow, and the faint scar along his cheek caught the firelight with each small tilt of his head. He carried himself with the habitual stillness of a man trained to conserve every movement, but his eyes, steel blue and sharp, held a distant weight, as if part of him were still somewhere far outside the cabin. Walter Granger sat beside him, bundled in the heavy parka Evan had wrapped around him earlier. His long, ash-gray beard hung in soft, uneven lengths over the jacket, and the wrinkles around his gentle gray eyes deepened whenever he studied Evan. The warmth had begun to return to his hands, though his fingertips trembled slightly each time he lifted them. Ranger, the black and tan German shepherd with intelligent amber eyes, lay curled across both men's boots, his thick coat rising and falling with steady breaths. The limp in his hind leg was noticeable but not severe, and the fire seemed to ease the stiffness. For a long while, the only sounds in the room were the fire and the quiet storm outside. Evan continued positioning logs with practiced efficiency, as though tending fires had once been part of his survival training, which, in truth, it had. Walter watched him with interest, then finally broke the silence. A man doesn't usually seek storms unless he's running from something that hurts worse, he said softly. Evan didn't react at first. He focused on the flames, watching them twist and climb around the logs, but Walter had struck close enough that the words seemed to press against his ribs. After a few breaths, Evan finally spoke, voice quiet and controlled. "I'm not running," he said, though he knew the statement wasn't entirely true, "just not ready to go back to normal life yet." "Normal," Walter repeated, a faint smile curling under his frosted beard. "Funny how the world expects us to flip that switch. One day you're in the fight of your life, the next you're supposed to smile politely at neighbors over morning coffee." Evan gave a short, dry laugh, one without humor. "Something like that." Walter tilted his head slightly, studying the young man's rigid posture, the tension in his jaw, the faint twitch beneath the scar on his cheek. "What happened?" Evan's hands paused mid-motion. He set the poker aside, stared into the fire. His throat tightened, and for a moment he seemed younger than his years, less a soldier and more a man caught between guilt and exhaustion. "My last mission," he began, slowly, "was supposed to be a simple extraction, in and out. But things went wrong fast. We got ambushed, lost 2 men before we even reached cover." He exhaled hard, the muscles in his neck straining under the weight of memory. "I carried one of them almost a mile. He didn't make it." Walter's expression softened. "That kind of loss doesn't stay on the battlefield." "No," Evan said, "it doesn't." Ranger lifted his head and nudged Evan's knee gently, as if sensing the shift in his heartbeat. Evan's hand moved on instinct, resting atop the shepherd's thick coat. The simple contact grounded him, pulling him back from the dark edge his mind tended to drift toward. Walter leaned back in his chair, the old wooden frame creaking beneath him. "You know," he murmured, "pain doesn't get lighter just because time passes, but sharing the load, that can help." Evan nodded faintly but didn't respond. He rarely talked about his past, not to strangers, not to friends, not even to fellow veterans who tried to coax him back into civilian life. But somehow, here in the middle of a storm with a legless old man and a wounded German shepherd, the words felt slightly easier. Walter shifted slightly, adjusting the blanket draped over him. "I lost my wife in a winter storm like this," he said quietly. His eyes clouded with memory. "She went out to get the mail. Ice on the porch gave way. I tried to get to her, but the chair wouldn't move fast enough." His voice cracked on the last word. "That was the day I realized loss can cripple a man even more than missing limbs." Evan turned toward him, the soldier's stoic mask softening. "I'm sorry, Walter." Walter nodded. "Life storms us all in different ways, but we're still here. That has to mean something." The firelight warmed the small room, reflecting off both men's faces and weaving their burdens into the same golden glow. Just then, a faint sound echoed outside, something sharp and metallic, muffled by the snow but unmistakably real. Ranger's ears shot upright, his body tensed. A low rumble built in his throat. Evan immediately shifted into a defensive posture. The transformation was instant and complete, like a switch flipping from vulnerable human to trained operative. His eyes narrowed, his shoulders squared, his breathing steadied to a silent rhythm. Walter glanced anxiously toward the door. "What is it?" "Could be falling branches," Evan said, though his tone suggested he doubted it. "Or the wind rattling old metal." Ranger growled again, deeper this time. He stood, favoring his injured leg, but ready nonetheless. His amber eyes stayed fixed on the door. Walter swallowed. "Or someone out there." Evan didn't answer. Instead, he rose slowly, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the cabin. He approached the frosted window, careful not to step into the direct line of sight. He leaned just enough to peer. Outside, snow swirled violently against the glass. Nothing moved besides the storm itself. He strained his vision, scanning the tree line, the ridge, the sloping trail they had climbed earlier. Then he saw it, faint but unmistakable. A set of fresh footprints half filled with drifting snow, leading toward the cabin from the direction of the woods. His pulse quickened. Those prints weren't there before. Walter saw Evan stiffen and whispered shakily, "What is it, son?" Evan stepped back from the window, voice low and tight. "We're not alone out here." Ranger growled louder, stepping protectively in front of Walter. The old man reached down and placed a hand on the dog's back, steadying him. "But who would be out in a storm like this?" Evan's jaw clenched. Someone desperate, or someone who doesn't care about the cold. He scanned the cabin quickly, the door, the weak window frames, the gaps between boards. This shelter was never built for defense, not against nature, not against people. Walter watched him quietly, recognizing the shift, the soldier taking over. "Do you think they mean harm?" "I don't know yet," Evan replied, "but we need to be careful." The fire crackled louder as if reacting to the tension. The entire cabin felt smaller, the air tighter, the storm outside heavier. Walter pulled the parka closer around himself. "If they need help, we can't just turn them away." Evan looked at him, those steel blue eyes glowing in the firelight. "I won't turn anyone away who needs help," he said. "But I can't risk letting danger in, not while you two are here." Ranger barked once, sharp, alert, ready. Then came the knock, soft, slow, deliberate, 3 taps. Silence. Then 2 more. Evan's breath froze. Walter's eyes widened. Ranger moved closer to the door, hackles rising. Whoever was out there wasn't lost. They knew exactly where they were going, and they weren't afraid of the storm. Evan stepped forward, every muscle ready to respond. Whatever or whoever waited beyond that door was about to change the night entirely. The knock against the cabin door had barely faded when the storm unleashed another violent wave against the walls, rattling the wooden frame and filling the room with a shuddering tremor. Evan Brooks's steel blue eyes stayed fixed on the door, his tall, sharply built frame coiled with silent readiness. Walter Granger, wrapped in the heavy parka and sitting stiffly in his chair, held his breath without realizing it. Ranger, the sturdy black and tan German shepherd, stood in front of the door with his amber eyes blazing, fur raised, and muscles taut despite the limp in his hind leg. But no second knock came, only the roar of the wind. Evan waited 10 long seconds before stepping closer, silent, careful, every motion precise as if he were back in the field. He placed one hand on the old handle, pausing to listen again. Nothing. No crunching footsteps, no movement. Only the storm itself screamed through the cracks. He slowly cracked the door open. Snow gusted in instantly, biting and blinding, but he pushed his shoulder against the blast long enough to inspect the porch. Ranger squeezed beside him, sniffing fiercely at the air. The footprints Evan had seen earlier were still there, half filled with drifting snow, but now they seemed older, blurred, stretched, as if whoever made them had passed some time ago. But no fresh prints, no sign of lingering presence. Whoever had knocked was gone. Evan shut the door firmly, locking it with the weather-warped bolt. No one's out there now. Walter exhaled, relief and fear blending in one fragile sigh. Maybe someone was looking for help like we were. Evan shook his head slightly. If they needed help, they wouldn't walk away from a warm cabin in a storm that can kill a grown man in 10 minutes. Walter nodded reluctantly. "You're right." But the old man still craned his neck toward the window, as if hoping to catch a glimpse of mystery resolved. The quiet didn't last long. A sharp crack echoed across the woods, followed by a deep, resonating thud that made the entire cabin tremble. Ranger barked, spinning toward the back of the cabin. Evan's instincts surged. He moved fast, crossing the room in 3 strides to the small, fog-clouded window at the rear wall. He wiped a patch clear and leaned to look out. A massive pine tree, easily 50 feet tall, had toppled under the weight of wind and ice. Its trunk now lay squarely across the only pathway leading back down the mountain. Snow cascaded down in soft waves from its branches. thickening the drifts around it. With the storm still intensifying, the snow would soon pile too high to dig through. They were trapped. Evan's jaw tightened. Walter saw the shift immediately. "What is it?" "The exit is gone," Evan said. "Tree took it out." Walter swallowed. Meaning, if we stay here and the snow keeps coming, this cabin could be buried before dawn. Walter's face blanched beneath his frost-kissed beard. Ranger let out a low, uneasy whine. Evan didn't hesitate. Decisions in his world had always been binary. Move or die. "We're getting out through the back." Walter blinked. "The back? There's no door." "There will be," Evan said, already grabbing the fire axe mounted beside the hearth. Without another word, he swung hard at the rear wall. The old wood splintered, sending sharp fragments scattering across the floor. Ranger backed up but kept his focus ahead, as if guarding the new escape route. Evan struck again, carving a rough exit, a gap large enough for Walter to be carried through. The cold rushed in like a living thing, swallowing the newly made opening. Snow whipped against their faces. Evan reached for Walter. "Arm around my neck, I'll carry you." Walter nodded, his fingers trembling as he hooked his arm across Evan's shoulder. Evan lifted him carefully, his strength steady, effortless but respectful of the old man's fragile frame. Ranger trotted ahead, limping but determined, nose to the ground as he searched for a path through the rising drifts. Evan stepped out first. Snow rose almost to his knees. The wind roared, tearing at his jacket and burning his skin. Each breath felt like inhaling shards of ice, but he kept moving. Behind him, Walter clung to him tightly, the parka half shielding his face. "I'm sorry you got dragged into this, Evan," he shouted through the wind. Evan shook his head. "I didn't get dragged. I'm choosing this." Walter's eyes softened at that, a warmth even the storm couldn't erase. They pressed deeper into the woods, moving uphill where the snow lay slightly thinner due to wind exposure. Ranger zigzagged ahead, occasionally stopping to sniff the air or check back on them, his amber eyes glowing fiercely in the dim light. Minutes stretched on. The wind grew louder, the temperature dropped further, the ground sloped sharply to their right, down into a ravine filled with jagged rocks hidden beneath fresh snow. Evan carefully skirted the edge, but the snow concealed uneven ground. His boots sank unexpectedly. His weight shifted, and suddenly the world tilted. Evan's foot slipped off the hidden ice beneath the snow. He stumbled sideways, his balance collapsing. Walter gasped as they lurched toward the ravine. Ranger whirled at the sound and sprinted toward them, despite the pain in his hind leg. Evan crashed onto his side, sliding toward the drop. He dug his free hand into the snow, trying to stop the slide, but the slope betrayed him. Walter clung tightly, terrified but silent. Just as Evan's boots scraped the edge of the ravine, Ranger lunged. The shepherd clamped his powerful jaws around Evan's coat sleeve, teeth gripping the thick fabric. His muscles strained, hind legs digging into the snow, dragging, pulling, anchoring. Evan stopped sliding 1 inch from the drop. Snow poured past him like a white waterfall into the darkness below. Walter let out a shaking breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "Dear God." Evan exhaled hard, heart pounding. "Ranger, good boy." The dog tugged once more, helping them back onto stable ground, then stepped back, panting in heavy bursts that formed white clouds around his muzzle. His injured leg shook from exertion, but his amber eyes were proud and resolute. Walter reached out and stroked his head. "You saved his life, Ranger." Ranger pressed against Walter's hand, his tail giving a single relieved wag. But the storm wasn't done. The wind howled louder, and snow began falling in thick sheets that blurred the trees into ghostly silhouettes. Evan adjusted Walter's weight and pushed forward again, voice steady. "We move. We don't stop until we reach higher ground." Walter nodded firmly. "Lead the way, son." Together, one man of strength, one man of resilience, and one dog of unwavering loyalty, they continued through the storm, leaning on one another against the cold, swallowing the forest. They didn't know what waited ahead, but they knew they couldn't turn back. Not anymore. The storm began to break only as the darkest hours of night surrendered to a faint silver glow rising behind the distant mountain ridge. Snow still drifted from the clouds, but softer now, as if the sky itself had grown tired of its fury. Evan Brooks trudged forward through the knee-deep white, his breath sharp, his muscles aching, but his steps steady. Walter Granger lay secured across his back, his frail arms wrapped around Evan's shoulders, his beard brushing against Evan's collar as the old man fought to stay conscious. Ranger, the resilient black and tan German shepherd, limped ahead with unwavering focus, his amber eyes fixed on the faint outline of a man-made structure nearly swallowed by snow. It was the new Ranger outpost, a sturdier, modern counterpart to the abandoned cabin they had fled. Its roof jutted through the swirling white, half buried but unmistakably intact. Evan exhaled, relief flickering across his sharp, tired features. His steel-blue eyes narrowed against the wind as he picked up speed, determined to reach the building before Walter slipped into deeper hypothermia. Ranger barked once, weak but triumphant. As they neared the outpost, figures emerged through the haze. 3 rescue personnel in bright red and black winter gear. Their reflective strips glowed faintly in the early dawn. The one in front, a woman, waved both arms as she rushed forward. She appeared in her mid-30s, tall and athletic, with a square jaw softened by warmth, even in this brutal weather. Her skin was pale from the cold, except for her cheeks, flushed a fierce pink. Her blonde hair was tightly braided beneath her rescue helmet, and her gray eyes, clear, alert, compassionate, sparked with immediate concern as she approached. "Sir, hold on, we've got you," she shouted over the wind. This was Samantha Hale, a senior search and rescue medic, known among her team for her unwavering composure and an almost stubborn refusal to lose anyone under her care. Years earlier, she had lost her younger brother in an avalanche, an event that forged her fierce dedication to mountain rescue. Her calm intensity radiated now as she gestured for her team. "Get the stretcher, let's move, people." 2 rescuers hurried forward. One was a stocky man in his 40s with a thick brown beard and deep-set hazel eyes, Marcus Keegan, whose gruff exterior hid a soft heart for anyone suffering in the cold. The other was a slender man in his 20s, freckles sprinkled across his cheeks, his red hair sticking out beneath his helmet. Liam Hart, the newest on the team, energetic and hopeful, eager to prove his worth. Samantha reached Evan first. "Set him down gently. I've got him." Evan knelt and eased Walter onto the waiting stretcher Marcus had unfolded. Walter's gray eyes blinked open, unfocused. "That you, Evan?" "I'm right here," Evan said softly, brushing snow from the old man's beard. Samantha immediately wrapped thermal blankets around Walter, checking his pulse with calm, precise movements. Liam moved to Ranger, gently draping a heated cloth over the trembling dog. "Easy there, buddy," Liam murmured, his voice gentle, his gloved hand stroking the shepherd's cold, stiffened fur. You've done enough for a whole lifetime tonight. Ranger released a low, tired whine, but leaned into Liam's touch, finally allowing himself to rest. Samantha glanced up at Evan, studying his face. Even beneath the frost and exhaustion, she saw the soldier in him, the rigid posture, the sharp awareness, the silent sense of responsibility. "You're freezing," she said. "We need to get you inside, too." Evan shook his head. "I'm fine. Just take care of them first." Samantha raised an eyebrow. "You're shivering hard enough to rattle your bones." "I've had worse," Evan replied. Marcus let out a grunt that sounded suspiciously like amusement. "They always say that. Then they pass out." Evan didn't deny it because, truthfully, his legs were beginning to feel like brittle iron, and the cold had settled deep in his chest. But Walter and Ranger came first, always. The rescuers hurried them inside the outpost. Heat blasted from the vents, artificial but life-saving. Bright lights filled the room. Radio chatter crackled faintly. Supplies hung from every wall. Antiseptics, blankets, ropes, oxygen. Marcus guided the stretcher to a cot. Samantha began warming Walter's hands while checking his vitals. Liam crouched beside Ranger, massaging the injured leg with careful motions. Ranger's amber eyes followed every movement, trusting but wary. As Evan stood watching, his breath finally steadying, Samantha approached him with a med kit. "Your face is wind-burned, and your hands—" She lifted one gently. Evan's knuckles were bleeding from where he'd struck the cabin wall, breaking them out. His fingertips were raw from cold. "You need treatment too," she insisted. Evan gave a small, tired smile. "Guess I do now." Samantha cleaned and wrapped his hands with steady, nimble fingers. "You brought them through a deadly storm. Most people wouldn't have survived an hour out there." Evan looked toward Walter and Ranger. "They kept me going just as much as I kept them." Samantha studied his expression, recognizing something fragile beneath the hardened exterior. "You're carrying more than cold in those eyes," she said quietly. "You've had a long night." Evan didn't answer. He didn't need to. Minutes stretched until color began returning to Walter's cheeks. He blinked awake, the exhaustion in his features replaced with gratitude. "Evan," he whispered, "come closer." Evan pulled a chair beside him. The old man reached with a trembling hand, gripping Evan's wrist with surprising strength. "If you hadn't stopped for me, neither I nor Ranger would be here. You gave us our lives back. I owe you everything." Evan shook his head, his jaw tightening with emotion he rarely allowed to surface. "Walter, you and Ranger kept me from slipping into the worst parts of myself. You saved me too." Walter smiled, the wrinkles around his gray eyes deepening. "Funny, isn't it? A man with no legs and a dog with a limp, saving a Navy SEAL." Evan let out a quiet, heartfelt laugh, the first true laugh he'd felt in months. "Life has its sense of humor." Ranger lifted his head at the sound of Evan's voice, tail thumping weakly against the floor. As dawn rose fully, golden light began pushing through the storm clouds. It glittered across the snow outside the outpost and spilled into the room, painting Walter's beard in soft amber and casting warm reflections in Ranger's eyes. Evan stepped outside for a moment, standing on the porch as the wind softened. Snowflakes drifted around him like tiny shards of light. For the first time since leaving the SEALs, he didn't feel hollow. He didn't feel lost. He felt anchored. Samantha joined him quietly, her blonde braid brushing her shoulder. "Beautiful morning," she said. Evan nodded. "Feels different, like something broke open." "Storms do that," she said softly. "They break things apart, so something new can form." Evan looked down at his bandaged hands. Maybe that's what I needed. Samantha smiled gently, but didn't push further. She simply stood beside him, watching the rising sun melt the icicles hanging from the roof. Behind them, Walter's low laugh echoed through the outpost, followed by Ranger's soft bark. Evan exhaled, long and quiet, letting the warmth of morning settle over him like a promise he hadn't realized he was waiting for. The storm had taken a long night from them, but dawn had returned something far more precious, a place to begin again, a reminder that no one who is truly lost stays lost forever, not when their life intersects with the right hands, the right hearts, the right companions. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with trumpets or blinding light. Sometimes they come quietly, in the form of a stranger who stops his truck in the snow, an old man who refuses to give up, or a loyal German shepherd who pulls with every last ounce of strength he has. And in moments like these, we're reminded of something deeper. God still works in the shadows of our hardest nights. He sends the right souls at the right time, guiding footsteps through storms we thought would swallow us whole. Maybe the true miracle isn't the rescue itself, but the way broken hearts recognize one another and choose to walk forward together when the world turns cold. As you go back to your own life, your own valleys and storms, remember this: no one is too lost for God to guide home. Sometimes his light arrives as a stranger's kindness, a dog's unwavering loyalty, or a dawn you feared you'd never see. If this story touched your heart today, I invite you to leave a comment, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to join us for more stories of courage, compassion, and the quiet miracles that surround us every day. May God bless you, protect your home, and guide your steps through every storm ahead. Amen.